Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for another Wednesdays in the Word. And we're continuing our new series entitled Faith Essentials for the Journey. And just like many of us, maybe even for this summer plan to take a trip, we know we got to carry some essentials, particularly if it's a plane ride and if it's a long trip. You need some essentials to pass the time on that trip. And so also too, we're suggesting that the same is true with faith. A lot of Christians start out with a lot of fire, a lot of energy, but something happens midway through the journey. Something happens when they hit a rough spot and they begin to fade, they begin to fall off. And I think the reason being fundamentally, and there are many reasons, we dealt with that in the introductory video if you want to check it out, but I think the fundamental reason is that sometimes we don't have the essentials. We haven't gotten to the discipleship. We don't understand the rhythms of the faith. And I'm arguing that there's a certain rhythm that God gives us as we walk with Him. And so that's the goal of this series, to help us find those faith rhythms, those faith essentials that are going to inspire us along the journey. So in this video, we want to raise the question, what is a gospel rhythm? Again, thank you for joining us, and I want to kind of really lay out this idea of the gospel and a gospel rhythm. I think it's definitely at the forefront of understanding what is the heart of Christianity, what is the faith of Christianity. I think a lot of Christians get confused here and kind of fall off because they're really unclear. Traditionally, when we hear gospel, we think it's God saving us for heaven. And I'm not here to suggest that's not part of it. Truly, faith in Jesus Christ does guarantee a home or in God's presence eternally. No doubt about it. But it gives the impression somehow that we have no responsibility in the current reality, in the earthly reality. And as my childhood pastor would say when I was growing up, if you want to know if someone's headed to heaven, you need to see if they're bringing some heaven on earth. And I think that is the totality or the full package of the gospel that we want to talk about. And so let's kind of dive into this idea first. What is the gospel? And then we'll get to what some of these gospel rhythms can look like. The word gospel actually means good news or glad tidings, and it's a reference to a messenger that would come from a faraway distance, maybe a battle or there was a war, and this messenger would bring good news to the nation or to the capital. And so that's the idea. We get a glimpse of this in Isaiah 52:7, which is a subtle reference to the gospel that would be the gospel of Jesus Christ. And here's what it says: how lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, or literally gospel, glad tidings, who announce peace and brings good news of happiness and announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. And so there we get an idea of just what the word means at its root level. It means good news. It means glad tidings. So whatever a gospel rhythm is, or whatever the gospel is, it ought to be done with joy. It ought to be done with gladness, because it's good news. It's not gloom news. It's good news. I came across a quote of a preacher, and I'm kind of paraphrasing the quote, but basically he says, we got to get out of this idea where preachers find a joy in telling people that they're going to hell. It doesn't mean that we ought not avoid the issue of hell. We ought to preach about it. It is a part of the gospel. But I think we live in a day where a lot of Christians find joy in God's wrath, God's judgment, and even hell's fire for the people they don't like. And I don't think that's the gospel. I don't think that's good news. If anything, the gospel is deliverance from eternal destruction. It's salvation from eternal destruction. It ought to be great news, good news, not some desire, some hideous desire where we share bad news with those that we don't like. So that's a hint of what gospel means. Well, what do we mean by the gospel that Jesus preached? Well, I want to start with Matthew 4:23, and here's what it says. Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming, here it is, the gospel of the kingdom. That's the phrase I want you to hold on. The gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease, every kind of sickness among the people. And so here the idea of the gospel is the reign of God from heaven in the earthly realm. It's about God's reign, the establishment of God's reign to reconcile mankind and all of the world back into relationship with God. To put it another way, Jesus Christ came to put the world right, including humanity. That is the gospel. It's the good news that God comes to bring peace. He comes to bring grace. He comes to make a broken world right. Now, obviously, as Christians, we kind of understand that to mean that on the one hand, the church has a role in making an impact and a difference in the world. But on the other hand, when Jesus returns and comes back at his second coming, he will complete what the church has been given the task to begin. And so all that is the gospel. It's the story of God, God's complete story from Genesis to Revelation, to put the world right, to reestablish the reign of God, a reign of goodness, mercy, and grace for all of mankind and all of the world. That is the gospel. And we see it very significantly in the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels when it comes to healing and exorcisms and casting out demons and devils and things like that. It's more than just this idea that we can create some sense of prosperity in this limited earthly existence for ourselves. It's more of a word or a testimony that the kingdom has come. The kingdom has come to make the world right with healing, any kind of deliverance. It's more than just God's ability to make our bodies well for a season. It's more about a glimpse that God is about to make the world right. And that's why we ought to have testimony when God moves on our lives. It's a testimony not only to what God can do in our lives, but it's a testimony that one day the kingdom will come and make the world right. And so that's the broad piece of the kingdom, this gospel of the kingdom that Jesus preached. The more central element or the heart of the kingdom we see in Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. And this one, he telescopes on human sin and human mankind. And so there's an element that is very broad, the gospel of the kingdom, but also too, there's a gospel for mankind. And that's what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 8. Here's what it says. Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and which also you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast to the word that I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that is Peter, and then to the 12, that is his 12 disciples or apostles. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of who remain until now, but some have fallen asleep, or that is, died. Then he appeared to James, that is his brother, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. And so that is the gospel. It is the resurrection of Christ, that he has defeated death, he has conquered sin, and that gives him the authority to reign over all things, to be the one who is the King of Kings of the kingdom, which is the gospel that he also preached when he was in his earthly ministry. And so again, here's the gospel. It is the reign of God that is reestablished to reconcile mankind and the world back into right relationship with God. That is the gospel. So let me just give you 4 quick opportunities for how we can kind of get this gospel rhythm. And I think the first one is pretty obvious. And the first one is number 1, evangelism. Matter of fact, the Greek word for gospel is euangelion. It's a Greek word. It literally is transliterated to mean evangelism. That's where the word evangelism or evangelical comes from, euangelion, which is the Greek word. So the gospel is also about sharing the good news that God sent Christ to redeem mankind from her sins. And we surely see that in Matthew 28:18 through 20, where Jesus tells his disciples, the apostles, to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. And so we do that when we share the gospel. We share how God has saved us. We share how God has moved in our lives. We share the good news. We sit down and share people. This is what Christianity is. Just taking a moment to explain what Christianity is getting into that gospel rhythm. And we need that. And that's how we sense the presence of God, the power of God, God moving in the midst of people, because God is already there. God is already working in this area, and he's looking for us to join him in that. And when we join him in these rhythms, that's when we sense the presence and the power of God. So number 1, I would say, would be evangelism. Number 2, I would say restoration. And we kind of alluded to this in Matthew 4:23 that we read earlier, that Jesus did a lot of healing ministries, or restoration ministries, what we would call them. And surely it's a word about God's ability and power to heal. But I think that's easy for God. So I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that Pastor Archer does not believe in the supernatural power of God to heal. I'm a living witness that God can heal. I had a blood clot almost 4 years ago, and the doctor is still baffled. I go to see him tomorrow, matter of fact, and he says, you really should have been dead. I don't know how you survived. Well, I know how I survived. It was God healing my body, and he's given me another chance. So I absolutely believe in supernatural healing. The question is, how is God using healing in the Gospels? And I take it, it's a work of restoration. God is putting the world right. The world never was supposed to have sickness. It was never supposed to have injustice and all of these other issues. And so Jesus comes to restore mankind. And we see this in Matthew 11, verses 4 through 5, when John the Baptist was in prison. He was in jail. Herod had put him in jail, and he would eventually be beheaded. And he was struggling with his own challenges as to whether or not Jesus was truly the Messiah. And here's what he says to the disciples of John the Baptist. He says, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to him. Why are these groups so important? These were the marginalized groups. These were the ones who were seen as outside of true Israel. And Jesus comes and ministers to them and restores them back to Israel, brings them back into God's fold, brings them back close to God. It's similar to that whole prodigal son idea. He went away. He's an outsider. He has destroyed his life. He has thrown himself away. And yet when he returns, the Father receives him back. It's restoration. He was already a son. He didn't need to be saved all over again. He was already a son. He was a son who lost his way, and the Father restores him back. In the same way, Jesus comes with his healing ministry, healing those who are blind, healing those who are lame, healing the lepers. These were the outcasts of society. These were the ones who were not welcome in churches or in religious circles or in family circles. And Jesus brings them back in and restores them. So anytime we can do any kind of work of restoration, helping people find their way again who maybe have lost their way, that's a gospel rhythm. That's a gospel rhythm. And how many people do you know need the grace of God, need the mercy, need to know that God's doors and arms of welcome are still open and waiting to receive them? That's another rhythm. Number 2, restoration. Number 3, reconciliation. The gospel is a word about reconciliation. Obviously, we're reconciled to God, but there's an assumption that if we're reconciled to God, we ought to be reconciled to others. One of the first things that Jesus deals with in the Sermon on the Mount is this idea that if you have anger with your brother, get it right. Be reconciled to him. And the gospel assumes the power to reconcile. We see a little bit of this in Galatians 2, where Paul and Peter kind of fall out about Jewish and Gentile dietary laws, and Peter was okay when no Jewish people were there, but as soon as some Jewish people were there, he kind of lost his way and began to become exclusive and isolate himself from the Gentiles. And Paul confronts him to his face and says, "You're not being true," watch this, "to the gospel." Look what he says, Galatians 2:14. "But when I saw that they were not straightforward," and the "they" is reference to Peter as well as Barnabas, "about the truth of the gospel," there it is. The gospel here is not just redemption from sin, but it's about how we reconcile with people who are different, who come from different cultures, who may even have different ideas that may be in conflict with our own ideas. "But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas and in the presence of all, if you being a Jew live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you can compel Gentiles to live like the Jews?" And so Paul here calls Peter out. The gospel is not exclusive. The gospel is inclusive. It embraces diversity. And I know that's a trigger political word in our culture today, but the church ought to be one of the most diverse institutions on the planet. It is universal. It doesn't cater to one specific ethnicity. It doesn't cater to one specific political ideology. It is a very universal gospel that brings people together and does not divide. And so the third thing I would say is reconciliation. How are we involved in reconciling with individuals who are Christians but may have very different beliefs, whether politically, theologically, or even culturally and ethnically? That is the power of the gospel. And then the last one, and surely not the least one, is ministry and service. And we see this also in Matthew 20, verse 28. "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And many, of course, this is a reference to his ultimate sacrifice when he would die on the cross. But also, too, in the context, it serves to how he sacrificed and gave his life to minister to the least fortunate. So the question becomes, how are you involved in helping others? How are you influencing others? That's a gospel rhythm. And so recently I ran into a very, very good friend I hadn't talked to in years. And he has been doing 501Cs. He's actually a preacher, but he never sensed that he was called to be a pastor, but really felt led to minister to black men, to minister to men who, for whatever reason, feel marginalized in society, may have been even incarcerated. Some may not have been incarcerated. Some may have struggled with some addictions or what have you. And God has really blessed him with a 501C that is designed not only to help men transition from this kind of, whether it's previous prison life or this kind of marginalized living, into a normal type of living. And part of that is discipleship, it's training, it's teaching and ministering to guys, and it's doing extremely well. I'm so proud of him, and just to see how God is working in his life. But that would be a gospel rhythm. He's helping men transition from this marginalized existence into mainstream society. That's a gospel rhythm. I got another really, really good friend, and we've been friends for years, who leads another 501c organization. But his ministry, we actually partner with them. They help men who may not have certain skills, get HVAC skills. And so they move from these extremely low wages to livable family type wages where they can support their families and they can be a part of mainstream society. And so I'm in connection with him as well. And so I'm saying the church and Christians ought to be in some ministry and gospel rhythm. Should you come to church? Is that a rhythm? Of course. Should you take the Lord's Supper? Of course, that's a rhythm. But I truly believe we've got to be involved in the rhythms where God is already working. And I believe he's always working in at least 4 areas: evangelism, restoration, reconciliation, and of course, some form of ministry. And when we engage those 4 rhythms, that's where we experience the power of God, the presence of God. We experience the sacred presence of God to move, minister, and to heal people. And I think that's what makes the difference of that faith essential that we need to continue this journey called faith with hope, with strength, with confidence, and with the joy of the Lord. God bless you. I'm really, really pumped and excited about this series. Join me for the next rhythm as we continue in this new series, Faith Essentials for the Journey.